It's my pleasure to welcome Peter Sands, who's the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. It's nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, so I wanted to start by asking you about the ACT Accelerator. I think people have followed this very closely because it's really a key part of the effort to address the COVID-19 pandemic globally. And the Global Fund is particularly involved in the testing pillar, but as a whole, the ACT Accelerator is still about $4 billion short of its funding goals. And so I wanted to ask you, what is the plan for getting there? What is this experience of trying to raise funds for the ACT Accelerator in this moment been like? What does that tell us about development finance today?
Well, to start with, you're right to focus on the ACT Accelerator. It's actually quite a remarkable mechanism that has emerged. It's a collaborative leadership mechanism by which the variety of agencies and entities involved in responding to COVID are working together. And the Global Fund is very involved. We're co-convening the diagnostics pillar with FIND. We're also co-convening the health systems connector, sort of cross-cutting pillar with the World Bank and WHO. And within the therapeutics pillar, we're leading on the supply work stream. So it's basically, we're deeply involved in every aspect except the vaccine side of things. In terms of where we are on the money side of the equation, well, we need $4 to $5 billion right now, but actually the broader ask is for significantly more than that. We had an initial investment case of $38 billion. I think the Coordination Hub reckons we've got about $10 billion of that. So we need, looking out over the next 12 months or so, more like 28 billion, of which 4 billion we need right now. It is challenging raising money for the COVID response. To be clear, we're not raising money for the ACT Accelerator as an entity. It's a mechanism, and actually the money goes to the individual agencies playing their different parts in the response. I think the big challenge is that these numbers are not going to be met purely through already overstretched development assistance budgets. The global response to COVID-19 has to go beyond that. And indeed, it has gone beyond that. The rich countries themselves have spent something in the region of 10 trillion in their responses to COVID-19. We need some of that kind of boldness of response in the way we both accelerate the development of new tools and ensure equitable access to them for everyone in the world.
So just to follow up on that, because you were talking about how this is sort of a unique mechanism and about how there's a need to go beyond sort of traditional sources of development funding. And so when you think about that, where do you think the ACT Accelerator is going to find some of that funding if it's not going to be from some of these traditional sources? Are there ways to bring in private finance to help support this issue? Are there some innovative mechanisms? I mean, we are seeing some of that on the COVAX, on the vaccine side, but are there ways to bring in some other mechanisms that either have been used or perhaps haven't to find some of this funding shortfall?
Well, I think fundamentally, most of the money is going to come from governments, because in fighting COVID-19 and getting the global economy back to normal, we're talking about public goods here and global public goods, and fundamentally it's governments who are best placed to do that. In terms of the actual mechanisms by which the money flows through, there are a variety. At one end of the spectrum, you've got straight grants, the kind of thing the Global Fund does. At the other end, you have SDR drawing rights, debt forgiveness, and so on, that in a sense improve the financial position of the low and middle income countries of the world, which then enables those governments to do more in terms of their domestic funding. And in between, you've got a variety of structures we can use for different mechanisms, of which COVAX is an example. But I don't think we should kid ourselves. Ultimately, the money comes from the capacity of richer countries' government balance sheets. Um, None of these mechanisms actually create new money. They just have different sort of trade-offs or advantages around how it gets channeled and the way it's targeted to different bits of the problem.
And so that sort of, I think, leads nicely into something else I wanted to ask you about, which is, we spoke back in 2018, right before you started your job at Global Fund. And at the time you were telling me you were a bit skeptical of all this talk about innovative finance. And you said sometimes these things look like tools looking for a problem. And it sounds like you're still perhaps a bit of a skeptic of some of these tools. And I'm curious, whether you think the development community has been able to, move beyond that sort of framework, or, what can be done to sort of harness new types of finance into the broader achievement of development objectives?
Well, I suppose you're right that I can sometimes come across as a bit skeptical around innovative finance. And my reason for striking that tone is because I perceive people within the development and global health world as often thinking of it as some sort of magic money tree out there, which if they could only work out how to unlock, would somehow solve all the problems. And that's not the reality. The reality is that it's the same money normally. It's just different ways of structuring the channel through which it is delivered. And that's true if you're talking about IFM or social impact bonds or COVAX, for example. Now, there's lots of good reasons why you want to structure it differently. So I'm not saying it isn't a bad idea to have new mechanisms, different ways of doing that. But I don't think you should kid ourselves that it's somehow going to generate massive new sources of money. The second point is this point about tools looking for a problem. I think it's much more important to think about what the nature of the problem is, and then design the instrument around that. I mean, the COVAX is a really good example of that. The reality is before we knew which vaccines would work, the question was, out of a portfolio of vaccines, did each country just choose one or two, or did you take a pooled interest in a larger number of them? And obviously the rational thing to do is to take a pooled interest, and COVAX was a vehicle that allowed countries to do that. But that's a good example of starting from the problem first and then designing the financing solution around it, rather than saying, hi, I've got this kind of particular mechanism, this social impact bond or whatever, let's go and find somewhere to use it.
And one thing you also mentioned earlier that we've talked about in the past is sort of this need to focus on domestic resource mobilization. And, when we spoke back in 2018, you talked about how the global health community in general needs to be more focused on sort of taxes and building a business case for health, and on domestic resource mobilization, on helping countries figure out how to find more resources for health in their own budgets. And I wanted to ask you how COVID-19 impacts these efforts. Obviously, a lot of countries are facing greater financial pressure, but perhaps that business case for health investment has never been more clear than it is today. And so I'm curious, what has been the impact on COVID-19? And, as we look to potential debt restructuring and some of these challenges that countries are facing, do you think health needs to be built into that discussion in new and different ways?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head here, in the sense of it cuts both ways. On the one hand, the fiscal capacity of most of the governments in the countries that the Global Fund invests in, so low and middle income countries, has been badly hit by the crisis. So the overall budget envelope has come down. On the other hand, COVID has delivered a very powerful lesson on the interdependence of health and the economy. Health isn't a luxury that you invest in once your economy gets to a certain stage of development. Health is something that allows your economy to grow and develop. So we are anticipating that what we're going to see is smaller total budget envelopes, but a larger share of health. Now, it's really important to make sure that happens, but it's also important to ensure that the decisions about how to allocate that health budget are done optimally, and then that the execution, the kind of, we don't want just more money for health, we want more health for money side of it, is done well, because there isn't going to be enough money whichever way we cut it. And so getting the efficiency side of it more effective is going to be crucial.
And so
but this, sorry, if I could just emphasize one point. COVID has delivered this really powerful message to us all that if we let health risks run rampant, then we don't just feel it in terms of health and lives, but we feel it in terms of the economy. What I don't think yet we've really focused on enough is the other side of the equation, which is that the upside from getting rid of health problems is as dramatic as the downside from being hit by them. So that if you take, for example, communities that are heavily burdened by malaria, taking that burden away, we know improves educational attainment because children aren't missing school. It improves agricultural productivity because families can work in the fields. It immediately opens up opportunities around tourism and so on, which haven't been there before. So I'm hoping that now that people are really looking at the interaction between health and the economy, they don't just look at the downside risks, but they look at the upside benefits.
Great. I wanted to ask you a bit of a broader question. And you obviously have a long background in finance. And one of the things that, we've seen over the last, several months is that it appears that COVID-19 has been accelerating some trends in the financial industry towards more sustainable investing or environmental, social, and governance investing, ESG investing, and to impact investing. These things were on the rise, but it now seems as though they're becoming even more popular and even more mainstreamed. And I guess as we look at these trends, my question to you is whether you think that's going to translate to more development finance, whether it can be sort of brought to bear to solve some of these challenges that we're looking at, that the Global Fund is looking to solve.
Well, my starting point actually would be to say that for most risk managers and ESG investors in the financial industry, COVID should be a moment of recognition of humility, because most of them utterly failed to anticipate or include this in their kind of modeling scenarios, right? So, and I think there has to be that recognition before you really get excited about what happens next. And I recall early on in the crisis, reaching out to old contacts at a CEO level within the investment industry, within the banking industry, saying, guys, you got to focus on what's going on here, and not getting much of a response. I found it very, very difficult to get traction on just the sheer scale of what was coming down the road. And my concern is that actually a lot of ESG investing has not really been, if I'm to be really blunt, about the underlying sustainability and development and climate issues. It's been about adding a value-added wrapper to active management, because active management is under huge pressure from passive investing. And it's sort of adding a bit of marketing gloss to it. What I hope is it does get more real and tangible, and therefore does have more direct impact on the targeting of resources to issues like health that do have a material impact on the long-term sort of economic and broader sustainability of societies.
What do you think it'll take for the financial system, for investors to actually take it to that next step?
Well, I don't think there's one kind of trigger point, but one very important thing that's happened is the IMF is now much more focused on health risks than ever before. The most recent World Economic Outlook had more discussion of the interaction between health and financial markets and the economy than we've ever seen. I had been trying, before I came to the Global Fund, when I was at Harvard, trying to persuade the IMF to take these more seriously, and I singularly failed. I was unsuccessful in doing that. COVID has been much more successful than I was. But that's a really important signaling thing, because if the IMF is taking this stuff seriously, that means governments take it, rating agencies take it seriously, and you begin to see the whole financial world beginning to think about this in a different way. And that will change the incentives for governments and companies. So when governments start finding that they're not getting foreign investment because the foreign investors are looking at them and saying they're not managing their health risks well enough, that changes the equation for a finance minister.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your insights. I think we'll be watching to see where a lot of these efforts go, but thank you again for your time and for being with us today.
Thank you.